That's helpful. Well, as you know, this morning we're starting into a new series of preaching. And the reality is we live in unprecedented days, don't we? There are huge cultural shifts that not only affect us, but affect the rest of the world. And the task ahead of us as a church is to know how we are to interact with that, how to share the gospel. But as a local body, we're also wrestling again, redefining our understanding what it means to actually be the Church of Christ here in Spadina and Dundas. Where are we going? And so because of these questions and the realities of that going on around us, we wanted to approach our exegesis, our expository preaching in a slightly different way. Instead of just taking a whole book and going from beginning to end, we wanted to actually take an important slice of it. We wanted to look at one of the Old Testament greatest saints and look at the life of Abraham. Now, as you know, Jesus Christ is the capstone of all God's redemptive purposes. And the New Testament is replete. It's got a full, rich theology that tells us who Jesus is and what he brought to the cross and how that death and resurrection actually affects and brings salvation and redemption to us. It instructs us as well on what it means to be a true disciple of Christ. In the light of that, in the light of God's call upon our lives, what does it mean to now follow Jesus? But here's the thing. With all of that theology and wonder that we read in the New Testament, it's so important to go back to the Old Testament because that's where we see faith in action. That's as we look at the men and women of the Old Testament that God is calling, we see life being lived out in a real world of injustice, real problems of uncertainty and sin. So there's no better place to go back to the narratives of the Old Testament because the struggles, the real life struggles of these men and women of God are for us examples, for good and for bad. They're important for us in a training of godliness. Now, it's important, I just want to highlight, do we have the slides up? Okay. If we know 1 Corinthians 10:11, I just want to read this for you quickly as we go by. Now, these things happened to them, that is, people in the Old Testament, as an example, but they were written down for our instruction on whom the end of the ages has come. Now, I don't know if you've ever thought about that before, but there is a direct spiritual correlation, Paul is saying, between these people who lived hundreds and thousands of years ago and us today with all of the wild things that are going on in our world. They are to be for us literally moral guides. There's what's called a typology going on here. They are to be moral guides for us and how we should live. So of all of the Old Testament saints that we could look at, probably the most important is Abraham. And I say that because Hebrews 11 and Romans 4 tell us that Abraham is actually the prototype or the archetype, the quintessential person who lives by faith. So his struggles are our struggles. We both live in this time of now but not yet. Abraham lived with the calling of God. He had received that promise, but he's unable to see any of the promises. He's in that time of promise waiting for fulfillment, just as we are. And like him, we are in this gap time. He provides an example for us, again, of what it means to live by faith. And at times, as we're going to see, what it means to avoid sin and the consequence of sin. But it's in this gap, this promise and fulfillment, the time that God has given each and every one of us, the days of our lives, in this gap of time where life itself can actually weigh us down. When we feel the tentacles of sin just taking hold of areas of our life and growing and festering, when we feel that life itself, as we saw in the book of Ecclesiastes a couple years ago, just has this weight of meaningless and exercise and futility to it. And so to start off, I just want to ask, where are you in your relationship with God in this time of the gap right now? Do you sense this great gulf between you, between God has promised us as Christians, as believers, as disciples in Jesus Christ, and what you now experience in your life? That's a great challenge. What do you do when all of the plans that you thought God had been leading you to, whether it's to a university, whether it's to career, whether it's to live in a certain place and raise your family there, and all of that seems to be crumbling down around you? It's a challenge to live by faith with the promise and yet be unable to actually see and touch the finality, the truth, the reality that we're still yearning for. And that sin wants us to reject, wants it to doubt. So the first lesson that we need to look at in Abraham's life here, we actually find in verses 27 through 32 that have been read for us. This is that time of Abram's calling. Now, I don't know if you were cluing in and listening as Wilson read it, but the reality is this is just simply a short snippet, an introduction, a genealogy. You're probably saying to yourself, chapter 12, that's where it is. That's where God reveals himself and cuts a covenant. This wonderful one God reveals himself and makes this covenant promise. And what are we spending our time in these first couple verses? Just genealogies. They're not that important, right? But I want to challenge you that there is a lot going on here. There's a lot of important background that comes now into this truth that actually leads into the calling, that makes Abram prepared for the calling, and would actually even define who he is as he lives out this calling. So the principle that we need to consider this morning is this: God knows how to prepare his people for the tasks he gives them. God knows how to prepare you for the task that he has ahead. Now, we have several people in our congregation who aspire to be at the very top of their game. It could be an instrument, it could be sports, it could be ballet, and they push themselves hard to make that passion their reality, and they put everything aside and set their focus on that. Well, I grew up in a little town called Huntsville. I think you probably know that. I went to Huntsville Public School, Huntsville High School. There was a young lady just a couple years ago in 2014 by the name of Dara Howell. I went to school with her uncles. 2014, she went to Sochi, won gold. Number 1 in the world when it comes to freestyle skiing. You know, that's the one with all the stunts, aerial flips, the moguls, the cross, the half pipe, you know, keeping as much time in the air as possible, slope styling. To get to Sochi and to win the gold, it was a huge sacrifice. There were sacrifices, there was trials, and there was tons of heartache along the way. It all starts, obviously, by just the basics, learning to stand on your skis and keep your balance, to start down the bunny trail, but at some point it goes into moguls and other things. But the reality is, at some point in that preparation, she stops playing with the other kids because it takes 5 to 6 hours a day at least to practice the basics of learning to fall right, of landing properly, of keeping your balance in the weirdest positions possible. And then I found out again the other day as I was reading her biography, besides running, she was actually well known for weightlifting. She had to do all that core exercise to get her there. Because this, again, was freestyle. So it is a free definition of that skiing. So no matter how many basics you got down, there was always something new to do, always pushing the bounds. It took years of blood, sweat, and tears, of tedious preparation and sacrifice to make her ready for Sochi. You know what? The same principle is at work in us today. It's the same principle that we're going to see at work now in Abram. God knew the task that he was about to call Abram to, and it needed some very specific, heart-wrenching preparation to make him the man that would actually be able to stand forth before God in that covenant relationship on our behalf. It's a time of preparation that started well before God even called him. Now, you'll notice in verse 27, it starts with that phrase, these are the generations of Terah. Again, one of these, genealogical things. What importance is that? Well, it's a grammatical sign for us as we're looking at the text here that we're entering a new section. And what does that do? It tells us that there is a real connection between what is about to happen and what has just happened, everything that's gone on before. So here's the truth. God didn't just show up in Ur and look around and say, whoa, I've got all of these older men. Oh, I'm going to just choose randomly. I'm going to choose Abram to be the covenant keeper. Here's the thing. In choosing Abram, God was intentionally making a connection right through all of the generations before back to Shem, the son of Noah. And so he's providing this direct connection, this thread of redemption right back to all of his other covenantal promises before, even going back to Genesis 3 with the original promise, excuse me, that the seed of the woman would crush the head of the serpent. There's a beautiful simplicity about this that we often miss. And it should bring a sense of heightened expectation and wonder. There's 10 generations from Adam to Noah. And under that, there's this covenant of universal grace. And in that, God has permitted sin to grow. But at the end of that comes judgment. God judges the world by bringing a flood and saves only Noah and his family. But after that, God looks at that and repents. He says, I'm never going to destroy the world by water again. I'm going to make a covenant with myself. I'm not going to do that. And here's the sign of that promise. It's the rainbow. So there's 10 generations from Adam to Noah that culminate or end in judgment and salvation. Now we're told that there's 10 generations from Noah to Abraham. It's a time, again, that we know sin has been growing exponentially in the world, that true worship of God is lost. Sin is festering. It's just growing to the point where the ziggurat has been erected, trying to reach up to the very glory of God itself. But this time, God is going to work in a particular way. He's going to choose for himself a people. And he's going to start with Abram. He's going to establish a special covenant of salvation with him and his offspring. So 10 generations from Adam to Noah, leading to covenant and salvation. And now 10 generations from Noah to Abraham, or Abram, in which there is a new stage set before us. God is going to do a new work. It's going to be a work that is very particular. This is a particular covenant. God is setting his focus and his grace on a particular people. He is choosing them as the means of salvation, a salvation that was only mirrored in Noah and his family. For 400 years after the flood, the line of Seth grew. It grew in sinfulness. It just festered. And again, the worship of God was lost. Now, we would sometimes say that God had a holy line that he was connecting. But by holy, we're not saying that they are righteous in any way. We're simply recognizing that God, in that holiness, has actually set them aside for a special purpose. So there's not a righteousness involved in that, but God, in his wonderful redemptive plan, has set the line of Seth apart. Abraham, and here's the reality, Abraham was in God's sight even before he knew that there was a one and true God. There's a continuity, there's a simplicity, a faithfulness, a beauty of design here. Abraham was already set aside as an integral part, an important, vital part of God's plan of salvation, even before he became a follower and a worship of Yahweh, the one and only true God. The challenge was to get him to the place where he could be useful in God's hands, where he could fulfill God's purposes. There was some very specific work that needed to be done in his life. And that's what we see in verses 27 through 32. It's all about death and loss. Now, just before we start unpacking that a little bit, I want to say that there are some challenges and complications in our understanding everything that's going on here. Because there's a difference, or there are challenges or differences between these verses that we read at the end of chapter 11, the actual call that comes in chapter 12, and then the other section, Stephen's speech just before he's killed in Acts chapter 7. So I'm going to take the straight path, and Stephen says that before Abram left Ur, God called him, and he left in obedience. But it does leave questions unanswered that I can't answer for us at the moment. The reality is there are two different time frames of how old Terah is when he actually leaves and when he actually starts having his children. If Abram actually left Ur, and that's his hometown, why in Genesis 24 does he send his son Isaac back to Haran to find a wife? Haran is the place that they've stopped at, not the place that they left from. We have the whole question in these verses. It's Terah who actually leads the group. It is him that we're told specifically who was leading Abram and Sarah and Lot out. So there's these things going on. The question of what is Ur? It is a city, but it was also very often a byword for the whole area around the Mesopotamia. So exactly, we don't know. There are holes in the story that we can't fill in. Despite that, we do know some important things that we need to think about here. And the first thing that we know is that there is family tragedy. Sometime before they left Ur, Abram's oldest brother, Haran, dies. Now, as we read the lists, often Abram is first. He's first in importance, but he's not the oldest son, as we look at and find out later on. So the oldest son of the family dies. Lot, Haran's son, Abram's nephew, now becomes Abram becomes the guardian of Lot. And that explains why in chapter 13, Lot is hanging around and following outwards, right? But it's a family tragedy that we know affects Terah, because Terah also leaves Ur. This, we understand, is where he's from. It would take a lot for a father to leave behind the rest of the family, of his brothers and sisters, aunts and uncles, or whatever it is, and to strike out. And at some point, the death of his oldest son, Haran, is involved in that. Now, I don't know if in your family you've experienced that. If there's been a death in the family of a child, it's a tragedy to begin with. But if it's the oldest son, and you're a culture that recognizes that embraces that all the hope is in that, that is a huge tragedy to overcome, let alone simply losing your child. The next we see is that this small group, which includes Abram, they leave Ur, and they get to Haran, but for some unknown reason, they stopped there. Literally, the words are, they settled there. And as far as anyone can gather, they stayed in Haran for about 25 years until Terah, the father, dies. It's not that God spoke to Abram and he immediately left and got to Canaan as fast as they could. And we don't know what happened, but something happened in their journey before they even crossed the Euphrates River towards Canaan. Somehow, something happened, and they got stuck in Haran. Not for days, not for weeks, but for years. We're also told that sometime in Abram took a wife by the name of Sarah, and that she was barren. Now, we all know what barren means, right? But in case we didn't know, he tells us again in the very next part of the sentence, she was without child. So there's an emphasis there that there is no human way she could have borne a child. Now, in the ancient world, as you can understand, the very survival of a family depended on having children. And even worse, the whole value of a woman was wrapped up in whether she was able to have a child and bring that herencia, the descendancy to the next level, to have a son. So barrenness in the Old Testament was a sign of the curse. And this brings a crisis, doesn't it? Knowing from the very beginning that as they leave before they even know God as the one true God and become worshipers, Sarah is barren. She can't have children. And that's going to create a crisis in a couple chapters, isn't it? Because the very person that God chooses to make this covenant, to be the founder of the Father of nations, be the founder of our faith, is unable to have children naturally, which means God himself must step in. He must do a supernatural, miraculous work in them. And that's the whole point of what's going to happen. But think of the heartache of not being able to have kids. We have a couple families in our church who have been married many years and who are unable to have kids. It's a heartache to talk to them. Your natural desire to be with your spouse is to have a family, to have that child. And you know they're a blessing from God, and for whatever reason, you're unable to. So here was Abram and Sarah, suffering, heartbroken that they can't have children. Lastly, we need to remember the call itself here, because God said what? Leave your country. Leave your country. He was to leave and not look back. And I don't know if you can fathom how much of a challenge that must have been. Yes, there was a call, but it was a call by an unknown God to an unknown place with yet an undefined promise. There was no clarity coming yet. Was perhaps the most impressive city in the world at the time. It was the height of any culture. It was the height of wealth, the height of mathematics, the height of astronomy, of reading and writing. Is the birthplace of all of these things. And he needed to leave that behind. A prosperous, vivacious, vibrant city, and to go to a place that he knew nothing about, a backwater somewhere way over there called Canaan. He may even have had to have left behind a prosperous family business, because Joshua 24:2 tells us this: long ago your fathers lived beyond the Euphrates, Terah, the father of Abraham and of Nahor, and they served other gods. Now, those words, served other gods, can simply mean that they were worshipers of other gods, but they can also mean that they were actually makers of idols, that they actually crafted the things that other people worshipped. And I think that's implied in the text. Abraham, or Abram, was born in an idolatrous culture. He grew up in an idolatrous culture. He was a worshiper of the false god, the moon god of Nana. Don't get any perception that there was a righteousness in Abram that necessitated the call of God. He did not worship God. He did not know God. He worshiped Nana. But if this verse actually implies what I think it does, then he leaves behind a business, a lifestyle, all that he knew to provide for his family. This was a radical job change late in his career. He was leaving everything behind. So in these few verses, we see great challenge. We see great pain that's all coming together to prepare Abram for what's about to happen, for the initiation of this covenant. But he's separated from his country. He's separated from his family with this heartache of having lost his older brother and now his father. He's separated from the destiny. He wants to go to Canaan. He wants to be obedient, but somehow he's got stuck in Haran for 25 years. And he's also separated from his dream of having a family with his lovely wife, Sarah. Now, any one of these things could be crushing on us. A burden that we wouldn't want on anybody. But together, they represent the shaping of Abram's faith and his character to prepare what God has in store for them now. God was preparing and molding him through adversity. Now, Ephesians 2:10 tells us this, "For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them." And what a wonderful promise that is. Because you know what? So often we can't see God's purposes in the middle of the things we're doing in life, right? Let alone when we're in the middle of a tragedy, when there's heartbreak and pain. I'm sure that as they're stuck in Haran for 25 years, he wants to be obedient, and he's saying, "What's going on, God? Why isn't my life working out as you had just said was going to happen?" I can't imagine them not, Abram and Sarah, crying for years, crying out to the very God who has just revealed himself to him. Why can't we have children? Now, that promise is made concrete a couple chapters later in chapter 15. But even at this very moment, at the initial of the call, "Lord, this is the greatest physical blessing that anyone could experience. And you're calling me to do this wonderful thing. Why can't we have children?" Now, we have the benefit of knowing the end of the story, don't we? But we need to remember that in this call, they're in the middle of searing loss, of hardship, and great pain. They're unable to see the great purposes that God is preparing for them. All they have is this calling that has not yet been crystallized into the covenant chapter 15. They simply have to cling to God, believing but not understanding. And I think we need to grasp that truth because it's a great encouragement to us, or it should be. Because there are so many ways that we could be experiencing heartache and tragedy in this life now. Perhaps you're in your 40s or your 50s and you've reached the pinnacle of your career. You have defined yourself by being someone who is able to be the best lawyer, to be the best businessman possible. And all of a sudden, without any explanation, you lose your job and you're about to lose your home. Maybe your marriage is struggling and the one of the two of you has threatened to walk out. It happens even to Christians, unfortunately. Maybe you've lost a family member in a tragic accident. Maybe as a young person, you're only 21 or 22, and the doctor comes and says, you have a life-changing disease. The rest of your life is going to be slow deterioration of muscle mass. You're going to lose your ability to speak. You're going to be confined to a wheelchair. Where's God in this gap? We hold tight to the promises, but we can't see the fulfillment. Here's the promise here. We need to remember that our hurt, our pain, our loss may very well be the thing that God is using to prepare us to serve in some way yet in our future. Have you ever thought about that? And the challenge for us is that we could go for years, potentially even decades, calling out to God, and we cannot see the purposes of God. And yet God calls us to faithful living for Him. It's a time when we must cling to Jesus, knowing that in God's plan for us, nothing is wasted, especially pain and suffering. Our pain is not wasted. Our sorrow is not wasted. Our loss is not wasted. Our defeats are not wasted. Our broken dreams are not wasted. Your tears have a purpose, and your broken heart has a purpose in God's plan. So the great spiritual truth that comes out in these verses is that God prepares us in the same way He prepares Abram, through trial and loss and pain and suffering. God knows how to prepare His people for the tasks that He gives us. Our Heavenly Father,